The Steelers are bringing in Cooper DeJean for a top 30 visit, and it continues to look more and more like cornerback is the other position to really watch out for in the first round. We'll talk more about that and take some of your questions here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making us your first listen every day because we're your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel Sportsbook is the number one sportsbook in America. Make every moment more because right now, new customers can get $150 back in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 back, win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. All right, on this Friday episode, brief news here on Cooper DeJean's visit. He's now a top 30 pre-draft visit for the Steelers, which makes a lot of sense because Cooper DeJean was one of the more talked about defensive backs going into this draft process. Our guy Mike DeFabo of The Athletic broke the story that he would be a top 30 visit for the Steelers coming up, and that's good news. That's good news for the Steelers because that's another top corner that they're taking a look at. And if you're not as familiar with the recent updates on Cooper DeJean, because we talked about him at the combine, he didn't run at the combine. There was concerns about his injuries. How fast would he actually be? How would he measure up? Well, he measured just fine at Iowa's pro day. Ran a 4.43 unofficial time there, which is pretty doggone good, which is what I said. I think I was saying as long as he was under like a 4.47, he was going to be just fine. But a 4.43, that's plenty fast and enough. Shows really good technique. Had a very good vertical of 38.5 inches. So like he's doing pretty well for himself right now. And 38.5 feet, excuse me. But looking at Cooper DeJean and what he's what he brings as far as a corner, he's one of those more flexible guys. He plays on the outside, he plays on the inside, he rotates around, he can play a little bit of safety. And the Steelers love those kind of chess pieces. That's kind of what they loved about Cam Sutton when he was on the roster. Played very well there. But even bigger than that, I was looking at just the top 30 visits and just like keeping track of like who's been in the most. And there's some things to tell about who the Steelers have been bringing in. Now, there are top 30, this is discounting top 30 visits that are like way down the list that definitely aren't first round guys. Like a wide receiver, Malachi Corley, he's a top 30 visit. He ain't going to be picked in the first round. I don't think Xavier Leggett of South Carolina is, but Adonai Mitchell would, most likely would be when it comes to wide receiver. So looking at that, which position has had the most of the first round graded guys has had the most top 30 visits? And it's pretty obvious if you look at if you look it up real quick, it's offensive tackle. Talisa Fuaga has been a top 30 visit. Marius Mims has been a top 30 visit. Troy Fatanu has been a top 30 visit, and Tyler Guyton's been a top 30 visit. And I wouldn't be surprised if J.C. Latham is brought to that list very soon. And that would be 5 first round graded tackles who the Steelers would have had brought in for visits this year. But if you were to guess which would be the next position that has the most first round graded guys who have been brought in for top 30 visits, you'd probably try, look around and think, well, it'd be center. Well, center, they still have time to bring in more guys, but Jackson Powers Johnson and Zach Frazier are the two guys right now. They could still bring in Cedric Van Pran, but you look at those two, that'd be next. But the next group appears to be, along with them, is cornerback, because right now with Cooper DeJean, you throw in him with Nate Wiggins, and that's 2 top 30 visits. Nate Wiggins, of course, got the Tomlin trifecta of the Steelers brass visiting his pro day and him being a formal combine interview and being a top 30 visit, usually a very good sign that you are a serious target for the Steelers first round. And Cooper DeJean won't be a trifecta guy because the top brass did not go to Iowa's pro day this past Monday. but he's still a major target with being a top 30 visit and a combine. But I'd also say, and I said this before when we were talking about the whole Tomlin trifecta thing, where you get all three of those factors of the Steelers showing interest in you. There are two more corners who fit that billing perfectly, and are first round graded guys by pretty much everyone. Terrion, Arnold, and Koolaid McKinstry, both of Alabama. Now, granted, there's a bit of a cheat there because when the top brass visited their pro days, they're both Alabama cornerbacks. So they visited them at the same time. So it's, you could say, well, maybe they were visiting for Terrion and not Koolaid as much. Well, that's fine. But either way, if both of them were brought in for top 30 visits, that would make the tackle position the other position out there that has 40 or no, not 40, excuse me, would have now 5 players who are graded as first round guys. 4 players graded as first round guys who would be brought in for top 30 visits. And I could foresee Terrion Arnold and Koolaid McKinstry getting those invites. But even without that, it is very clear what the Steelers are prioritizing right now for first round guys. And again, you look at right now, they could still bring in a Graham Barton, and that would be interesting to see if they consider him a center. Zach Frazier, I think everyone kind of doesn't put him in the first round. We talked about this yesterday with Nick Farabaugh about him and Jackson Powers Johnson being lowered to the second round. But still, if those are likely second round picks, and the Steelers are anticipating the center position to be their second round move, makes sense to also interview those guys and get a closer understanding of who they are, so that you're more familiar with them in the draft process. But back to the point here that the Steelers are prioritizing here. Again, I think it goes back to this is what Omar Khan and Andy Weidel want to do with the Steelers front office. They want to draft for positional value. They want to still do best player available, but understand which positions are the most important on the field. And that's a tricky thing to do when you're also evaluating what type of players at these positions are the most important ones. And the Steelers, I think they'd like a ball hawk. They like guys that can go after the ball, but they'd also, they always are about cornerbacks that can tackle, be physical. And Terrion Arnold is one of those guys that has the technique and the physicality and would make a lot of sense. Bryant McFadden of the All Things Covered podcast with Patrick Peterson said on his show, if Terrion Arnold or Quinion Mitchell fall to 20, the Steelers need to just sprint to the podium and pick one of those guys. But you're probably sitting there thinking, well, wait a second, if they draft a corner, then what about offensive tackle? What about center? Because then you put at risk, maybe you can get one of those positions filled in the second round, but could you get them filled in the second and then the third round? That would not be as easy of a task. And we'll explore that in a little bit here. But I think the bottom line is that the Steelers, they're kind of acknowledging like, hey, they're preparing for all the different ways the board can break. Like we talked about how I showed you guys the mock draft that I did for the Raiders Nation Radio Network show earlier this week when I talked with Nick for yesterday's episode. And in that situation, both Ola Fashanu and Talisa Fuaga fell to the Steelers at 20. And I was like, well, I'll go with Fuaga because I think he's a better run blocker. I think that's something the Steelers really need right now. But there's plenty of chances for different things to happen and for, maybe there's a run at offensive tackle and the Steelers need to prepare. They can't be forced into signing Jordan Morgan, as a player, the tackle out of Arizona, who I think has a decent chance to be good in the NFL, but not, you don't want to make him your first round pick. So if you're the Steelers and you're sitting there and you're saying like, man, things are rough, go. If your things are missing, all the guys are being taken at offensive tackle. Don't force yourself into a hole by overdrafting another offensive tackle. Go get the position that might be ignored a little bit more right now, and that could be cornerbacks. And I think there's enough players that are graded high enough and at the positions of value that are important to the Steelers right now that if there's a run at one of these positions, the other position will benefit because their top players will go further down the board, and that'll allow Omar Khan, Mike Tomlin, Andy Weidel, that crew to do what they do and try to find another addition for the team. But I think it's also important to address if that happens. Let's say offensive tackle isn't the move in the first round, and they go corner. How can you help this team's offensive line after that with maybe starter capable guys who are going to answer the call, be good at their jobs, and kind of be the guys that Mike Tomlin talks about when he says like the offensive line is going to be a big part of their plans. moving forward, and they haven't addressed the offensive line in free agency. We'll get into how that can happen if they don't go with an offensive lineman in the first round here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. That's what brings home the winning trophy. And it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. They have superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit every ride, every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts that you need at the prices that you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay's Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our episode here, and I wanted to take a step back because I thought that this conversation about corners and how it's right up there as the other position that they're probably going to try to draft in the first round. I thought it'd be interesting to explore what kind of options would be there for the Steelers at center and not center, but at tackle and really the whole offensive line. If the pick goes to some other position, when we've been talking about that's a huge need for the Steelers right now, and there's a lot of great value for it. So asking that question was our guy Michael from San Diego, but more so about what if they went with center. But still, I think his premise on the center position, taking that early and worrying about other offensive linemen later, still applies pretty well to if the Steelers go with a corner and then have to answer both offensive line positions later. Here's Michael's question.
Hey, Chris, this is Michael from San Diego. My question for you today is, if the Steelers go center in the first round, who are some options at tackle in the second round that you think would be a good fit for them, if that's how the board plays out? Thanks, Chris. Have a good one.
Thank you, Michael. And as always, you can call into the Locked On Steelers call-in number at our number 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute, and we'll try to get you on the show. But to answer your question there, Michael, and let's stick with the center scenario for a second. Say they absolutely need to go get offensive tackle in that situation. I still don't think they're going to draft center first round just based off of all the things that we're saying there. So if you're looking at second round offensive tackles, let's wipe away the guys that are first round or even fringe first round guys. So Joe Alt, Talisa Fuaga, Olu Fashanu, J.C. Latham, Troy Fatanu, Marius Mims, Tyler Guyton, all those guys gone. Then in that second round group of guys, you have second to third group of guys. You have other guys that I really like as far as some of the things that they bring to the table. I really like Patrick Paul of Houston. I think he can get really physical. Jordan Morgan of Arizona, Kingsley Suamataia of BYU. All three of those guys were Senior Bowl interviews for the Steelers. But then you get a little bit further down and you start to see other players the Steelers have taken interest in at offensive tackle, one of them being Blake Fisher out of Notre Dame. I like the little bit of Blake Fisher's tape that I've been able to scrounge up and take time to watch. I think that he could be a guy in the middle rounds. I'd even say if they can get him in the third round, that might be the perfect value for his situation. But he's also another top 30 visit for the Steelers, as is Pitt offensive tackle Matt Gonsalves. But again, local guys don't count towards the top 30 count. But still, either way, the fact that they are willing to take a closer look at some of these guys, I think is a good sign that, hey, there's interest in preparation being put in to say, like, hey, when X thing happens over here and this position runs out, we go and get this other position that's really important. You're able to still go and address this important position at offensive tackle in the second round. So again, if you're looking at those types of options, I'd say Jordan Morgan out of Arizona, Kingsley Suamataia out of BYU, Patrick Paul out of Houston. There's Kieran Emegadije of Yale, but Blake Fisher out of Notre Dame, I think would be great value, especially if they can get him even in the third round with one of their third round picks. But That's the question there. But also, let's explore this from another angle here, kind of stretching out Michael's question here. What if they don't go center? What if they go cornerback in the first round? Kind of tying it to our first segment here. And so, if you go corner in the first round, you still need to address center and offensive tackle in this draft, and that becomes harder to do now with those guys, because now you're sitting there and you're saying, all right, well, center, you want to get one of the top guys because you need a starter there. So you probably take that one with your second round pick, maybe even trade up to get a better second round pick to make sure that you get them. But then where do you go to get a tackle after that? That's where it gets tricky. And I think that's where you might run into, if you're the Steelers, you might run into a Blake Fisher type situation or a McKinstry type situation, or even a Roger Rosengarten out of Washington. And the West Coast guys are always tricky because they're, the Steelers top brass won't go out that far, but they will still send people, and they did with Roger Rosengarten of Washington. So all that to be said there, I do think that there are options available, Michael, at offensive tackle, but then they start to get more question marks. They start to become less complete pictures as far as what you want in the offensive tackle position. But all that to be said, I do think that there is a contingency place in play, just kind of, or a contingency move in play just in case they can't go get their offensive tackle in the first round. And also, let's be real again, like, about the tackle position, the Steelers have been, have kind of dealt with the Dan Moore situation, and he's still under contract. If worse comes to worse, maybe you still find another answer there, but I do think that the offensive tackle position, that if you're looking at it, there's answers there. I think Roger Rosengarten, like I said, would be another potential guy. Wouldn't come in right away and start, but could be a sort of extra answer there if they need it there. But that's where those are the targets that I think you're looking at there. If you're going to ask me my favorite, I really liked parts of Patrick Paul's game. He has a lot to polish. But if you're able to pull that off, I think that would be a really good sign that, like, hey, the Steelers, they got an offensive tackle here. They got a top corner there. There's chances for to continue to building. And again, if that corner is like, a franchise cornerback, like if you're looking at that, and it's and you get Terrion on, or you get Cooper DeJean, that is valuable. That's extremely valuable. And then you have a 1-2 punch at cornerback for the next 8 to 10 years, probably with Joey Porter Jr. And that's the makings of a good defense, having good outside corners who can cover place to place and also be flexible and help in other ways. So I'm saying all that to say, I do think that there are options there, laying out the second tier guys. I think Patrick Paul would be interesting. But at the end of the day, we got to still see how the Steelers play this out, who they want to draft, what positions that they look at the hardest. And again, they're running out of top 30 visits, but they still have some to use. And I think that'll be interesting to see, interesting how they play that moving forward, because again, offensive tackle, corner, those seem to be the primary positions right now that everyone is going to try to take advantage of in this very deep draft class at both positions. So we're going to take another break. When we come back, I want to take another question. And this next question is very interesting to me because it deals with the crux of why, when some people are talking about why not just go get a center, this is a more in-depth explanation why. A center in the first round, excuse me. And why not they spending big there? But I want to get into that question here on the next after this next break here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue with today's episode, and I want to answer some of your questions that you have as you've been calling in with. Again, you can call in at 412-223-6644. Leave your name and your question, and keep your question under a minute, and we'll try to get you on the show. This one comes from here in Pittsburgh, our guy, Scott.
Hi, Chris. This is Scott from Pittsburgh. I'm a little confused about this idea of positional value. I understand it's always been about rarity, You get paid more because of supply and demand. But on the field, every player contributes just as much as every other one. How do you define it? Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate your question as always. You can call in at 412-223-6644. Get give us your name, where you're from, keep your question under a minute, and you can get your question on the show like Scott. Also, I gotta give a shout out to Scott because I don't know if he knows, but I know that Scott Pavel. He's been an OG in the draft communities. He's been a guy who's made big boards since before I made big boards. So shout out, Scott. Hope you're doing very well, and thank you for calling in with your question. But Scott, let's get into this. And I think this is a very good question that allows me to explain something that I didn't think to explain. I just kind of assume like, hey, people get this, we move on, because there's always so many fast moving parts. But let's explain positional value for people. So traditionally, it's just a precursory look and saying like, hey, which positions are doing the most to win games? Which positions are that important to the future of a team, making a Super Bowl run, and looking at which parts of the teams are the most valuable in the biggest moments. I think that's where it starts, and as far as determining positional value, and then it's just stacking that up. But make no mistake, a lot of it is also kind of like what you were alluding to, the market itself. And that's where I see opportunity when it comes to understand for the Steelers to say like, hey, you know what? Positional value, you got the corners, got the receivers, got the tackles, all really deep here. This makes a lot of sense. This makes a lot of sense to go draft these guys high. And part of this is because these are positions that when their best players come out and they're ready to get paid and they're getting their biggest contracts, these are the positions where oftentimes the contracts get the biggest as far as the skill players. Now, quarterback is what quarterback is, but quarterback's like the top position. The quarterback gets paid on a whole other scale that's ridiculous. But even with that, if you looked at just an example of just like how different some of the contracts you can get for the top quarterbacks, like Joe Burrows, who's averages out at $55 million a year. It's not what the actual cap hit is, but it's the average per year of his current deal. But if you looked at like running backs, the highest paid running back is Christian McCaffrey right now, and he averages $16 million per year. So you're talking about a really big difference when it comes to that position, or to the payments of those positions. And so part of understanding the positional value is looking across the board and seeing which positions just the market is better on. And sometimes the market can be very volatile. You could just be in a place where you don't fully get a grasp of what the market is like. But let's look at different positions just to give you an example of which positions are more expensive, because that's what teams are willing to pay for. Like quarterback is the obvious one. We've gone over running back. If you're a superstar running back, they'll pay for you. But if you're not a superstar, if you're just a decent player, then not as much. Wide receiver, premier position. Their top guy is Tyreek Hill. He averages $30 million a year in the league. So like that's total value his contract. And wide receiver is another position where like that's obvious 30 mil. That's a lot of money. But let's look at tight end. Pat Freiermuth, very good tight end, right? The Steelers know that if they're going to pay him, they're not going to pay him ridiculous amounts of money, but like they would for TJ Watt. TJ Watt, edge rusher. That's a prime position. That's one of the most valuable positions out there. Like right now, the average per year rate for the top guys, Nick Bosa, is an average of $34 million a year. Right now, TJ Watt's contract averages out at $28 million a year total wise. And again, that's not the exact salary number. That's just a way of conveying to you like how much typical salary cap space does this position take. But then when you look at tight end, and this is why I think the Steelers have a decent chance of re-signing Pat Freiermuth, the highest paid tight end is Darren Waller at $17 million a year on average. George Kittle gets $15 million a year. So if I'm Pat Freiermuth, I'm looking at that and saying, hey, there's an opportunity where I can get paid to be a playmaker in this offense without them having and kind of advertise like, hey, you can pay for a playmaker that can catch the ball and run and do all these things, and without paying super duper wide receiver money, which is what, sometimes has to happen when you want guys like that. And when that happens, it's less money you can spend elsewhere. And make no mistake, you still want to get those superstar wide receivers when you can get them. But this is a good example of, value and times to take advantage of it. So I truly think, Scott, part of it's, it's not me that determines the value of these positions. I think it's analytics departments that look at things and they say, okay, this is what we think is the most important. And looking at that and looking at how the crux of games changes with those positions and what they can do and the matchups that they create, I think it does make sense for, when you're talking about in today's world, the offensive tackles being more important than the center. And I get Scott's point, like no person is bigger than a team, but it's just, I think this is a chance for an acknowledgement that's like, hey, these teams are trying to build rosters and you have to build them in smart ways. So get these high positions of value in the draft so that if you do hit there, you have your own guy, you can set your own pace. You don't got to chase down, you don't got to chase down a player on another team who might not be a fit or might be a reach, or you might pay too much for this. This is under rookie deal. It's a good situation right there. And I think that's where, again, positional value gets deemed as like, again, like the safety position don't get paid like that anymore at a free agency. And a lot of them, when you look at the safety position, the value, a lot of those guys, they're not getting drafted in the first round. So, all that to say, I do think that the Steelers are handling the way that they're valuing positions the right way, but I hope that that's helped Scott understand where positional value is coming from. It's coming from the teams that are in the know of what teams are targeting and what the priorities are. So that's what positional value means. It's simply just about what positions are more likely to help you be a Super Bowl team. So thanks again for tuning into the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com. Find me here on the Locked On Steelers podcast every day, Monday through Friday. Talk about your Pittsburgh Steelers back Monday here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.